Hey friends, it's RSKT, and in today's video, I'm going to show you how to design, rig, and animate a character all inside of Moho Pro. If you watched my previous video, you would have seen that I managed to take artwork I'd created in Affinity Designer and rig that up for animation, but I hadn't really played around with a lot of the drawing tools built inside of Moho, so I decided to change that with this project. And for the animation, we're going to be focusing on animating this little guy today. I'll make sure that the full animation is included at the end of this video, but it goes for a minute, so I'll save it for the end. So I originally screen recorded this entire project and was just planning on narrating over it like a lot of my other videos. I started sharing little teasers of it here and there on my Instagram, and then Moho went ahead and shared my rig on their Instagram, which was a huge feather in my cap, by the way. Thanks very much, guys. But after doing all of that, I had a lot of people reach out to me and ask me a lot of questions about the design process, the rigging process, and even the animation stuff. So I figured rather than narrating over certain parts, I actually went ahead and re-rigged this character from scratch and then provided some voiceover work for that. I really want this video to be a really great learning resource for a lot of people who are diving into Moho. So while there's still going to be a lot of the time-lapse recording thrown in there, there's a lot more tutorial stuff in there too, so you should be able to follow along with this. As usual, if you have any questions at all, please be sure to leave a comment down below. I do my best to reply to every single comment, so let me know if you're having any issues. I'm still kind of a beginner at this software myself, but I hope it's able to help you in some way. Now, before we get started, I just want to point out that this video is hugely inspired by the webinar on Moho's YouTube channel by Paredes, and I'm really sorry if I'm butchering that name. It's a really fantastic resource, and it was the jumping off point for me starting this project, so I'll be leaving a link to that down below in the description. In the webinar, Victor demonstrated that he could use vectors inside of Moho to mimic more traditional art styles and get a lot of cool textures and stuff going, and I really wanted to try that out for myself. By using vectors, we actually get a lot more control over how the character is rigged and animated. As I said in my previous video, I designed my character in Affinity Designer first, so when I wound up importing it in, I was quite limited in just how much movement I could get away with, but designing everything by vectors inside of Moho gives us a lot more creative freedom. Moho has some really great tricks up its sleeve when working with vector artwork, so without any further ado, let's dive in and get started. So if you scroll down far enough in my Instagram, you'll find that I actually drew this little guy years ago with pen and markers. It was a quick little sketch that I didn't think anything of at the time, but I thought it might be the perfect candidate to try some of Moho's drawing tools. It's worth noting that I used my mouse and keyboard to illustrate this entire thing. And I'm not saying that as a brag, I'm saying that because you can definitely use a graphics tablet, but don't stress if you don't have one. Moho is actually pretty great to draw with when you're just using a mouse. Also, just a quick tip, if you're finding the rest of your artwork looks blurry when you have a layer selected, just uncheck GPU caching in the display tab and everything should display correctly. Let's talk about styles. Styles allow you to set up brushes that you'll commonly reuse. This way, I can make sure that I'm using the same brushes, the same size, the same colors in different parts of my drawing, making it easy to jump back and forth between these when I need them. It also makes it a lot easier to edit your animation too, because any change you applied to a style that you've already used in your project is going to update across your whole project. Let's quickly show you how these are set up. What I'll do up here is we're going to select new. I'll call this shoot line. I'm not using a fill, but I am using a stroke. But I don't want to define the stroke color in here all the time. I mean, I definitely could. There's nothing really wrong with that because the line color never changes. So I suppose we could copy this black from over here. Cool. So now every time I select this style, we're locked in to using only that color for the outline. And I'm not sure I want to be locked in for the width. I mean, again, you definitely could, just as long as you're happy with it. I'm going to leave it unlocked for now. And we'll select a brush. I think I just use this one down here because it's nice and scruffy. And you can change all of these settings to sort of get different effects or whatever you're after, but I'm just going to leave it as is for now. So once we're happy with that, we can come back up to Style, select None, and then under here, I can select Shoot Line. And now I've got my line work. I can make the brush a little bit smaller, a little bit bigger, and there we go. I'm all set up with my line work, ready to go. I'm going to set that back to none for now, and up here we'll create a new one. We'll call this shoot color. I don't want to mess around with the fill. I don't want to mess around with the stroke color or the stroke width, but I do want the brush to always be this guy. Go back to none, and under style we'll select shoot color, make this brush a little bit bigger, There we go. So we can change the color of this at any time to whatever it is that we need. And that's pretty much how I did all of the color work for this. I used the freehand drawing tool to draw my lines and shading. You can use the Bezier handles to reshape things. You can also change the line width with this line width tool. You can pull and push points with the magnet tool. And if you already have a point selected, you can just tap Tab to select all of the points that are connected to your selection. You don't have to do this, but I actually put my outline on one layer and the shading on a layer below. In hindsight, this might not have been necessary, but I did it so that I'd have a bit more control over how things deform during the rigging stage. There's no right or wrong way to do this, it's entirely up to you. I then went ahead and drew each part of the character, paying special attention to where the different sections should start and end. Some things need to be drawn a little bit further, like his abdomen, just so that when we rotate the character, we can still see what's behind him. You'll notice that I copied everything the way it is in the original drawing, but later on I found that I needed more symmetrical leg shapes to help get him to animate properly. This was a small headache to deal with, but it actually showed me that even once you've rigged and animated a character, you've still got full control over coming back in and changing your illustration and rig later on. As I'm going through this illustration, I'm making sure to name all of my layers so I don't get confused later on. You can even put things in groups if you need to, just to stay a little bit more organized. Nothing's set in stone, all of it can be edited later on if you need it to be. Let's quickly talk about line boil. Go into the brush settings of your styles and you can boil this line. That means that they'll animate. You can change the frequency of this, like how many frames it's going to happen over, and it helps to give your animation a little bit more of a hand-drawn effect. So at this stage, our character is fully complete. Everything is being separated onto separate layers to make the rigging process a lot easier. Now we get to enter the fun world of rigging. All of the rigs I've done in Moho in the past have been fairly basic, but with this one I really wanted to push myself and learn some new techniques throughout the process. I still think I've definitely got a lot more to learn in this department, but I'm pretty happy with how this rig turned out overall. So let's break it down step by step so you can see how this thing was rigged. First, we need to group everything and then convert that group to a bone layer. You'll now notice that the tools panel has changed and we have the add bone icon. Now make sure that you're on frame 0 for all of your rigging. This is where you build everything and then the animation happens from frame 1 onwards. If certain tools disappear or things don't work, just make sure that you're on frame 0 before troubleshooting. We start with the root bone. This will be used to move all of the character except for his feet. I've got this facing down so that it's easy to grab in amongst his legs. Then I've gone ahead and made 2 bones for the body, and then 1 for the neck, and then 1 for the head. These bones are all connected, so make sure you don't click off, otherwise they won't be parented to one another. You can always check the parenting of your bones with the parent button and reassign things as needed. Then I've done the arms, the hands, and I've given the hands 2 dangly little bones at the end for those dangly things on the end of his hands. We'll quickly look at parenting. Just select this button and we can see how everything is parented together. So we can see that this bone goes to that parent is that one, that parent is that one, this parent is that one, and so on and so forth. So right now I'm actually noticing that this arm isn't parented to the torso. And what we want to do is fix that. So we'll select this arm, hit the parent icon, and then we'll select the torso bone. And now that just makes sure that when we move our torso bone, and this is going to look pretty rough at the moment, but yeah, our arm essentially follows it. I've given 3 bones to each antenna, 3 bones for the abdomen, and then I've gone ahead and drawn in the legs and feet. And sweet, the basis for our rig is pretty much done at this point. But if you start to move things around with the manipulate bones tool, which is this icon over here, see a bunch of blue stuff shows up and everything looks pretty weird. So we need to start working on all of this. First of all, what I like to do is press Ctrl A to select all the bones. And what you're looking at with all of these red things right now is the bone strength, which we can access by pressing S on our keyboard or selecting this guy. I'm just going to pull them all way down. This doesn't matter too much for the way that we'll be rigging this today. It's more of like an influence control over how like a lot of your bones interact with other things around. One thing I'm noticing straight away too is that the torso isn't moving with the root bone. So we need to make sure that the root bone is selected. Click the parent button, and yeah, it's not parented. So we'll just select the root bone now, go back, and hey, the root bone is finally doing its job. So for example, now we can see that like when I rotate the torso, because this arm has influence, it's moving his abdomen and whatnot. And that's kind of like what your bone strength is doing. So if I were to press S on my keyboard and increase the bone strength, you can kind of see how that's working. It's kind of just showing how much influence a bone has over a certain given region. But we're not really going to stress out too much about that because we'll fix all of that up in just a minute. Before we go any further, one thing I want to point out is setting up control bones for your feet down here. So with this bone selected, we're going to come down and just draw a new bone, pretty much just going straight out to the side here. But what we're going to do is reparent it and just click and drag off. So that bone shouldn't be parented to anything. Then what we'll do is select the leg bone again, go into parent and press Control on our keyboard, and while that's being held down, we'll click this other bone. Now if we select that, and I'll just turn down the bone strength there, you'll see that we're able to move our leg solely with this point. And it's really useful too, because while we move our root bone around, the leg will stay in the position. Now, if pressing Control while doing the whole parent thing is confusing to you, don't worry, there is another way to do it. You can just select the leg bone, which I haven't named, and you should name your bones, but we'll select the leg bone. We can see that this bone is B37, so with the leg bone selected, we'll go to bone constraints. We can see that the target in inverse kinematics is B37. So another way to do this would be to, select the leg bone down here, line it up for this other one, press P to parent, we'll unparent that, and then we can just see that bone is called B38. We'll come in here and select B38. Same thing. Just turn down the bone strength on that. Cool. So I'm just going to quickly go ahead and do that to the other legs. And great. Now all the legs stay in place. You can see that things are getting a little bit janky and broken, but hey, we're pretty much on the money at this point. If you move things right now, it's all going to move as one big mess. So we're going to go ahead and fix that. Select a layer and then select the bone we want with the bone selection tool. Then up the top, you can click Link Bones. This will make sure that the bones are only influencing the layers we've linked them to. Once you've repeated this for all of the other layers, your rig should be moving quite nicely. You'll thank yourself for naming all of these bones later, especially when we get to the smart actions in the next section. You don't have to do this, but personally, I would do it now before moving forward, because if you change them after making smart actions, things will start to break. One final thing I like to do here is set angle constraints for a lot of these bones. I know I don't want this arm bending past a certain point, so using an angle constraint makes it so that that can't happen. You don't have to do this now though, you can always set this up later if you like. Hey, so I hope that you're enjoying the video so far. If you are, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, I mentioned in my last video, I just launched my very own website. So if you like art and you want more art tutorials like these, feel free to head over there. Or even if you're curious about jumping into the world of music production, I have a lot of music tutorials there too. Be sure to check out some of the merch that I have to offer while you're over there. You can get t-shirts and stickers and prints of some of the artwork I've featured on this channel. And sign up for the newsletter if you want to be notified when new stuff is coming out for RSKT. Anyways, back to the video. So by this point, the main rig is fully set up, but we still have a fair amount of cleaning up to do. We want to use smart actions to help dictate how certain parts of the body should deform when it's being animated. You don't need to do this for every part of your drawing, just where it's needed. First, open the Actions panel. You can use Ctrl K to do this. Select a bone and make a smart action. This smart action has its own little timeline, independent of our main timeline. I like to go to frame 48, then use the Rotate Bone tool to rotate the bone in one direction. You can use the Magnet tool to help fix up your drawing. Exit back to the main line, and now you can repeat this. Create a new action, rotate the bone in the opposite direction, fix up the drawing, and it's rinse and repeat for the rest of your rig. Again, you don't have to do this on every part of your drawing, just where you need things to deform a little bit differently. Now let's look at setting up smart bones to help give the character some more depth and control. We're going to set up 2 bones to help rotate the body, one for his torso and one for his abdomen, and give it some angle constraints. You also want to make sure that this bone has no bone strength. Now create a smart action and rotate the bone to one side. Use the layer transform tool to move the arms, and use the magnet tool to help shift parts of the torso illustration. I know it looks like I'm doing a pretty rough job here, but I'm doing this only for the demonstration. Now you want to go back to your main line and create another new action and repeat this for the other side. We're going to put a separate control bone off to the side and set its strength to 0. Now you want to parent your smart bone to this. Then we can take that control bone and set its position to follow the root bone, but only in the horizontal axis. That way it'll move alongside our character, but it won't be bouncing up and down every time our character does. We can hide this extra control bone and make it a shy bone. This gets it out of the way when we're animating, but you can always show it again by going to the bone menu and selecting show or hide shy bone. Next, you want to repeat these steps for the abdomen, and now we have 2 smart bones that really give our character a lot more dimension. Now, before we go ahead and do the head and eye controls, I just want to show that I've made smart actions for the face as well. I've created a box just to help neaten things up, and it's linked to a shy control bone that's behaving just like the other one we just set up. I've got controls for each eye to make the top eyelid angry, neutral, or worried. I have 4 controls set up to open or shut the eyelids. The top 2 do the top lids, and the bottom 2 do the bottom lids. Then I've got a larger bone in the middle that controls all of these. This makes it easy to animate a blink, but we can also use the other lid controls if we don't want a blink to happen at the same time in each eye, or we want to push more expressions. You might find that these controls don't work properly on frame 0, but if you go to frame 1, you can get them all to work. The way I set up this blink control is by creating a smart action, and on frame 1, it's all the way to the left, and on frame 48, it's all the way to the right. Then I've animated the lid bones that are either opening or closing. And when I go back to my smart action, that middle bone now controls all of the lid bones. Finally, I've got a control down here for opening and closing the mouth. All of these are parented to the shy bone above, and the box around it is also linked to that shy bone. Remember, we want to use the Bone Dynamics menu and connect this to the horizontal position of the root bone, just to make sure that it moves in line with our rig. Next, let's look at the head control. Create a single point bone. Now create 2 bones either side. Create smart actions for these bones. One is looking up and down, and the other is looking left and right. Next, you want to create single point bones at the end of these bones. Make sure they aren't parented. Next, you want to select these up, down, left, right bones, and then control click on their point bones for each one. I'll just repeat it with this one. If you need to do this the other way around, this bone is called B53, so I can just select this bone, go to inverse kinematics, and select B53. Now, what we want to do with this bone is go into bone constraints, and we're going to do a position constraint. So we need to find out what this center bone is called first, which is B49. So with this selected, we'll go position, B49. And because this is only going to be moving in the vertical axis along with this bone, because it's the up and down movement, we'll just set this one to 0. And then we'll do the opposite for this. Go into position, B49, and we only want it to move horizontal, so we'll set the vertical to 0. So now when I come in on frame 1 or past 0, we can select this bone, and you'll notice that everything moves in the correct way. Now I'll put a circle around this. It doesn't matter if the center bone goes outside of the circle, nothing will break. It just makes it easier for you to move and rotate the head with a single bone and keep track of where everything is. I've parented all of these bones to a shy bone, just like we did on the others. Finally, for the eyes control, I've set up 3 bones and created smart actions. One looks to the left and right, one looks up and down, but for the center bone, I created a smart action that moves the pupils either closer together or further apart. This is our gaze control. Using these 3 bones in conjunction gives us way more control over how the pupils work. The only other thing I did from here was set up a rig for the fly. We have different controls for different things, and I've even set up a stretchy control so that we can have his neck stretch out when the mantis goes to bite his head off. I did this by setting the squash and stretch scaling to 500% in the bone constraints menu. Finally, you'll see that after I finished animating, I added in a shadow underneath the mantis, just to help make it look like he was a little bit more grounded to an actual floor. This has a bone attached to it that is constrained to the horizontal axis of the root bone so that it stays on the ground but still moves with our character. Then I have 2 smart bones for it. One is a smart action that gives it some sketchy movement and it cycles throughout the entire animation, and the other makes it bigger or smaller depending on how close the mantis is to the ground. Phew, that was a lot to take in, and I know that it probably went by really quickly, but I'm trying my best not to leave anything out so that you can try this out yourself. I learned a lot by making this rig, and in hindsight, I probably would have added a couple of extra controls, namely like on the wrist, so that way I'd only have to animate 1 bone for the arms instead of all of the bones, much like we set up in the feet. But at this stage, I'm really happy with it. Our rig is now fully complete, so we can finally start diving into animation. Now, first off, animation is an entirely different beast to learn on its own, and I'm really not the greatest animator in the world, and I do not practice it enough. So rather than spending hours showing you how I animated this piece by piece, what I want to do is kind of show that process, but really set you up with a few resources so that you can up your animation game at home. First up is the Animator's Survival Kit, which in my opinion is the holy bible of animation. It's a fantastic resource that's going to show you how to animate just about anything, and it's written in a really entertaining and informative way. I cannot recommend this book enough. It was written by Richard Williams, who worked with like the 12 Old Men at Disney, and you've probably seen a lot of his work in famous things like Who Framed Roger Rabbit and The Thief and the Cobbler, or The Princess and the Cobbler, depending on which version you've watched. Either way, I owe Richard Williams so much. The guy is a genius, and this book is a must for anyone serious about animation. Next up is The Illusion of Life by Disney, which is a really big book, and it's definitely less of a guide than the Animator's Survival Kit. That said, it does a really great job at showing you how Western animation progressed over the years, how the 12 principles of animation were formed, and really just gives you an in-depth look at the animation process from start to finish. It's not really going to teach you much about the actual process of animating. It's more of like a general overview and history of Disney. But that said, there's still a lot of really good and useful information in here. The main reason I'm showing it today is because it shows a really great example of how the animation principles came to be and how they're used. Personally, I think the best example of the 12 principles of animation was done by Alan Becker, which is the guy behind the good old Animator vs. Animation cartoon. A while back, he put together a really fantastic video series that shows the 12 principles of animation in really great detail. He's got a great understanding for it, and it demonstrates each one with like different sort of little funny cartoons. It's just a really fantastic resource, so I'll be leaving a link to that down below in the description too. So where does that leave me? Well, I want to walk through a couple of useful things I found out along the way while I was animating inside of Moho, and showcase a couple of the unique tools that Moho has to offer and how I went about using them. I'm definitely not an expert on any of this, and I've still got a lot of learning to do, but here's some of the stuff I learned along the way. You can zoom in and out of your timeline if you're finding it a little bit small. There is an onion skinning tool. You'll notice that there is now markers either side of our timeline bar, and we can just click and add new markers, and that'll turn on or off onion skinning. You can click and drag keyframes around in the timeline, and if you hover over one, select a few in front of it and hold Alt, you can scale these keys to have actions happening faster or slower. There are, of course, different types of keyframes. You can have either stepped or linear or smooth. You can set up easing. There's ones that are noisy and ones for elastic. But a really useful one, of course, is the Bezier keyframe, which if you turn these into a Bezier keyframe, you can then edit them in the graph editor. This is really fantastic because the graph editor gives you full control over just how fast or how slow things are easing into one another. The noisy keyframe is actually pretty useful too. I used that to help animate the head while the mantis was chewing. Cycles are a thing and they are also great. I use them to animate the fly's wings. It means that I only have to create a small animation and then that continues to cycle until I tell it to stop. You can even create animations in the Smart Actions panel and recall them later into your main timeline. This is super useful for setting up walk cycles and other common actions, but I didn't actually wind up using it for any of this. There are a ton of other functions in this timeline, but I honestly haven't even begun to explore them at this stage. I just wanted to get up and animating. So there are a lot of moving parts for this character, and animating them is going to be a really time-consuming process. But Moho has a couple of really cool tricks up its sleeve to help animating certain parts a lot easier. For the antenna and the little dangly things on his hands, I actually use the Bone Dynamics tool. This way I can set up like torque and a little bit of spring amount so that I don't have to actually animate them at all. They just move in relation to how his head and hands are moving at the time. This saved me a ton of time. Originally, I also set it up for the abdomen, but I wanted a lot more control over how that moves, so instead I animated that part by hand. I decided against using cycles for this, and just started to have the character move across the screen before coming to a halt. Honestly, I really should have planned out this animation with an animatic first and had a clearer goal in mind. I did not have a single idea of what I wanted to pull off when I started this, so I was almost just animating straight ahead and seeing where the animation took me. I think next time I'll definitely block out the animation with stepped keyframes and then move on from there into the Bezier keyframes. It would have saved me a ton of time and made the whole process a lot easier, I think. Eventually, I realized I wanted this to be about a fly that was buzzing around the mantis's head and have the mantis catch him and bite its head off. That seemed a little dark by the time I got up to that bit, so eventually I added in a scene where there were some more flies that started attacking the mantis for revenge. I had to get a little tricky when it came time for the mantis to grab the fly. Originally, I wanted to try and parent one bone layer to another because obviously the fly is on its own bone layer, but I quickly found out that this isn't really possible. What is possible though, is that you can have bone layers inside of other bone layers. You can also animate layer order and the visibility of different layers. So for this, I duplicated the fly's rig and put it inside of the mantis's rig. I linked it to the hand bone of my mantis. Its visibility is set to off in the properties tab, and it switches on right as the mantis grabs it. When this happens, the other fly switches off. Now it looks like the mantis has grabbed the fly and is holding onto it. The fly stays attached to the mantis's hand and moves along with it, and now the mantis can fully interact with the fly. When the fly's head is pulled off, the head layer disappears to make it look like the mantis is eating it. Kind of brutal, but I'm super glad I got it working. As I walked through the rest of the animation process, I was really happy to see how my artwork was slowly coming to life. The animation itself is a little rough around the edges, but I think it definitely gets the job done. One thing that took a lot of time was animating the abdomen. I was originally going to use Bone Dynamics for this, but I really wanted more control at my fingertips, so I did it all by hand. Overall, I was really impressed with just how far I was able to push this 2D rig into really cool dynamic poses with quite a lot of control over the facial features. Considering just how easy it was to design and rig this character, I wouldn't mind creating more insects in this style. Having everything drawn and rigged makes jumping into the animation process a breeze. You get to spend a lot more time focusing on the animation process itself, since everything else has already been worked out in the design stage. Well, all of that hard work has finally paid off and I've finally completed my animation. I wound up grabbing a few public domain sound files and then arranging them over the top of my animation in Ableton. Ableton's really great because you can drag in a video file and then pretty much do all of your sound design in the one app. It's really fantastic. You can probably do audio inside of Moho, but I honestly haven't even looked into it yet. I just wanted to get this animation finished and I was already really comfortable with how Ableton worked. I added a bright little ambient track that I designed using my AE modular system over here, and if you want more detail on what that is, feel free to check out my music channel. I have a whole series dedicated to it over there. Either way though, I'm super excited to be able to share this final animation with you, so let's finally check it out. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching it through to the end. It really means a lot for me. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe if you haven't already, and feel free to leave me any comments down below in the comment section if you have any questions. Also, don't forget to check out my website if you want more tutorials like these or want to check out some of my merch. Hit the like if you like, and if you don't, tell me why. Please subscribe. Check me out on Patreon, and thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.